Hey everyone. Today I want to teach you about accuracy in Conclave, well, aiming in Conclave. This video was going to be all about mechanical skill, but I decided to split it up mainly for the sake of organization. I'm not going to talk about aim settings until the end of the video because I don't know how much I can say for keyboard and mouse users, and I want to say the stuff that applies to everyone first. Anyway, there are three aspects to aiming as far as I can see. So there's snapping, tracking, and leading. So snapping applies to all weapons because when you put your reticle on the target, basically. Tracking doesn't necessarily apply to all weapons, but it can potentially. And it's when you keep your cursor on the target as they move or whatever. And then leading is when you account for aiming where the target would be when the projectile you fire would hit. And of course that applies to weapons that are not hit scan. There isn't a whole lot to say about these skills, but I think I have some helpful things to say for anyone struggling with them. Snapping in particular I find to be highly affected by focus, more so than you'd likely expect. You can have your full attention on the game, but using your aim simply by second nature, which isn't a bad thing, but it helps sometimes to put extra attention into the aiming itself. And it's particularly helpful this time because it can be done so quickly that not much attention is taken away from other things. If you ever want to practice snapping outside of Conclave, I would recommend using a high fire rate semi-auto that one-shots whatever enemies you may be fighting against in your normal missions. And I think the best example would be Vectus or Vector Climb Depleted Reload, and one or two Arcane Momentum sets. You get constant snapping practice while doing your normal farming, and it's pretty powerful, so if you're good at aiming, you'll be able to still complete your missions pretty efficiently, which is something that I'll try to keep consistent with all these other examples. Tracking can benefit from increased focus too, but you'd have to track for most of any engagement that you're in, if not the whole engagement, so it can hinder other skills you may need at the time. Even so, finding good times for that increased focus can make a huge difference. Practicing tracking outside of Conclave is a little more tricky since you need a notable kill time and significant enemy movement. You can use an auto or beam weapon, and I would particularly find one that has high crit chance and or gas proc consistency for extra headshot damage. In case you don't know, crit headshots deal quadruple the damage of crit body shots, and the same can be said about gas procs. I personally use Quantum Vandal for that. Leading can probably also benefit from increased focus to some degree, but I personally find that that's not enough to be worthwhile. The key is to really just have a mental note of where to aim based on the enemy speed and your weapon's flight speed. On weapons it's very hard to see the projectiles as they're firing, which makes aim adjustments difficult to make. I previously had this issue with Daiki before I started using prisma arrows on it. When you can see the projectiles, you can know exactly how your aim is off, so you can do better on later attempts. Also, some weapons like Sniper have visuals of non-hit scan projectiles, but that visual has no effect on whether the shot hits or not because the weapon is actually hit scan. It's worth being cautious about that if you don't know whether a specific weapon is hit scan or not. If you want to practice leading shots outside of Conclave, I'd recommend using whatever weapon you'd want to get better at leading with, or one with the same flight speed, especially against enemies that are difficult to hit, like enemies that are split up by Nova, flying enemies, and or enemies at long range. I actually think that doing this is how I got good at using Ogres. I often try to aim in places where I'd kill the enemies in the least amount of shots possible, which could be specific areas and groups of enemies, or directly on the head of specific enemies. These skills carried over to most other projectile weapons to a degree, but only to a moderate degree in comparison to Lens and Ogres, because Lens has the same light speed and of course Ogres is the weapon that I was using. That's why I recommend using the weapon that you want to get good with, or the one that has the same flight speed. In Conclave you already have to account for much different enemy movement, So a different projectile speed to also adjust for would make your PvE practice matter much less. Enemy players can also actively react to your projectiles to dodge them, which really shifts how they can be effective. At around 12 to 15 meters, players with an average reaction speed have the potential to dodge direct hits with a projectile with a 60 meter per second flight speed, which both Ogres and Lens are. That doesn't account for AoE, but it's just an example of what to look out for. Dagyu by default has triple that flight speed, so it can be dodged from 36 to 45 meters with average reaction speeds. So yeah, enemies that dodge you are something to be wary of, and if you're looking to dodge others yourself, stay tuned for our next video, which will be all about movement. Now onto settings. Making sure that you can perform certain actions without taking your fingers off whatever you aim and move with is crucial. So of course I'm on PS4 and I'll show my controls here. And these are also very similar to my Xbox controls. So you can see that my jump button here is L1 and my crouch button here is I think L3. And it's very helpful for having smooth control because you can use these actions without having to take your fingers off the sticks in this case. So I can aim and stuff, like you can even see that I have my activate selected power here. So if I'm using Smite, for example, I can still be actively aiming and then still be able to use it. So anything that you want to be able to aim with, anything that you need to aim with, you want to have on some button other than something like X or triangle or whatever like the equivalents are, just whatever lets you keep aiming and moving as you're pressing it. On PS4, I use a controller with extra buttons, a Razer Raiju to be specific. In my case, I have assigned all the D-pad functions to buttons that can be used without taking my fingers off the sticks. So I just assign those to the extra buttons which are placed specifically for that. Which is very helpful for having smooth control. Now on Xbox I use a default controller though, which really shows my gameplay, since you can often see my movement interrupted while toggling through abilities using alt-fire channeling. Oftentimes I even avoid using these functions because I know that I'm like at a disadvantage when using them. Despite that, you can see that I still play quite well on there, but there's definitely an upgrade to be made. My point there is that you don't really have to worry about having anything fancy. You can still play well without it, but then once you have the opportunity for an upgrade, you'll probably see the difference with it. Besides that, you want an aim sensitivity high enough to track and snap to whoever players you find yourself in situations against. What sensitivity that is will really depend on what situations you put yourself in though. So like someone who plays a lot at close range will probably have a different optimal sensitivity than someone who plays mainly at long range. So if you find that you just can't turn fast enough for some things you need, you want to increase it. At the same time though, the sensitivity should be low enough to give you a satisfactory amount of control. This could be like max sensitivity for some people. Like there are definitely people who can aim above average at max sensitivity. But most people are better with something lower than that. And even esports players and various shooters, they tend to use a sensitivity that's not max because the accuracy matters so much there. And not just that, but like their accuracy just isn't good enough even at that like peak level to be able to use max sensitivity like that. So basically it's just not what they're best with, even though it's an objective advantage if you have that level of control to handle it. For everything I've said here, I think the most notable thing I can tell you is just to experiment with all these things in mind. You can copy a good player's setting, strategy, and stuff, which can work well as a template, but you likely need to make adjustments to suit yourself. Also practice, because someone might get mad at me for not telling you to practice a bunch. You should know that already though, so that's all for now. See ya.